some people from Chicago and all various areas. So what Shrikant and I have been talking about for some time was the differences in cardinalities. We find that, well, as Sunil had mentioned, things have been running on kind of a mechanistic path for some time, even though software is a complex adaptive system. Plugging the book one more time. But we find that there are assumptions people have made, and those are based on history. They aren't always valid assumptions anymore. They change, right? For instance, everybody knows that if you want to get something done, you have to run it as if it were a contracted project, right? Well, it turns out that that's not really necessary. You don't necessarily run everything as if it had a known endpoint and a known schedule. You don't invent endpoints and schedules to run software. You may find that you don't need that if you're running a product, right? So a whole bunch of unchallenged assumptions used to be present. When I was a younger developer, we always knew that you had to do a lot of work and then you make a release. You make a release at the end of some period. And that's just how that works, right? And we learned over time that things, when you go to integrate at the end of your project, they often don't integrate well. So you do a bunch of work and then you spend a bunch of time on integration. Well, when you integrate, you have to also test. So you bring all the testers on board late because it's a project. And so you do all the work and then you are integrating and testing and then eventually you release, and that's how a project works. Well, that was 1983. Do our assumptions change since 1983? Well, yes, our assumptions changed quite a lot. So for instance, how often could you release software? Well, in 1983, you were doing a really good job if you could release once a year. That was really good. Why? Why was it once a year? Well, it was 1983. We used floppy disks, right? So you built the software, you tested the software, then you had to produce a whole bunch of floppy disks. You had to get them all copied. And then you had to put them in mailers. Well, are you going to stick them in an envelope? Oh, no, that gives the wrong impression. We have to have printed boxes. We have to have printed books. We have to have clever packaging. It has to look good. Well, now we spent all this money to try to make a release. We have to make sure people buy it. So we need to schedule in advance to have a release party. So there has to be some big media event so that we can make a release. So, you know, once a year, so you spend, you know, the first couple months figuring out what you're going to release at the end of the year. And then you're working on it. And then at some point, the art and the manuals have to be produced. And then as you get to the end and you get through integration, you know, once it goes on the floppy, you can't change it anymore. So whatever bugs there are, those are bugs forever. And if there's a patch release, it's going to cost you millions of dollars to release it because you have to go through the whole process again. How to install, you need instructions, you need books, you need packaging, you need printed materials. Well, releasing once a year was a big thing to do. A lot of people released 18 months, year and a half, right? Okay, we fast forward. How much material do you have to produce to release now? How many of you have had to send floppies out for copying? Ever? Me? Okay. There are a few of us older guys that did that. How about DVDs? How many of you had to press DVDs to make a software release? Just a few of us. Not very many. Most people, how do you make a release? Goes on the server. Here's how you make a release. Done. So it may be that those kinds of assumptions are not really valid anymore. And that may be changing the way the world works, right? So a couple of the things we thought about was right away, how many features to a release? I'm sure you've thought about this. How many features go to a release? What's the cardinality of this relationship, right? 10 features per release? How about 100 features per release? What sounds about right to you guys? What would you think? Well, what we're finding out is you could do 1 feature per release. You could work on one thing, make it work and release. Now that sounds pretty radical to some people. Hold on to your hats. You can do many releases per feature. Sometimes when you say this, you can watch people's brains explode. You see that look on their face that goes, oh, that's not right. How can you do that? You can have many releases per feature. You can have many releases per change. Well, how can you possibly ever do that? Well, first off, one way is when you look at story mapping and example mapping, you can split things down. You can build a little bit of the feature that helps a couple of people, but not everybody. And you can release that. And then as people start using that, they'll complain about what's not there. That's feedback you use to expand the feature and schedule the next change. So you are gradually broadening the functionality of that feature over time. That is one way to do it. Another way is with a dark release. And this was a famous story from Facebook. The chat feature they thought would be interesting. They would like to add it. They didn't have it at the time, the messenger. So they thought, well, what are the risks involved? Well, one of the risks is it could overwhelm our infrastructure. Maybe we don't have the bandwidth for this to even be possible. So they built a bit of the feature and they buried it inside the web page. So what happened is if you went into Facebook and as you're poking around, it would generate random length, random messages and send them to other people who are in your friends list. Now they wouldn't see it. It would be received because it's a dark release. It would happen behind the scenes and no one was aware. Now, the more people on Facebook, the more traffic was being generated. And they could measure then how much bandwidth was being consumed and whether the feature could be successful. When they worked out the infrastructure and the information management, the bandwidth management, then they made the feature present. So there is multiple releases doing pieces of dark release and fixing the dark releases as they move forward to getting the thing actually finished. So you can have many releases per feature instead of many features per release. Sound crazy? Well, not now, because the cost of release is low. We don't have to protect the transaction cost anymore. It's a beautiful thing. Sort of like when Git came out, it used to be that everybody knew your version control needed to have locking. You need to make sure only one person could edit one file at one time. Because if you and I both edit the file, you know, we could corrupt it. We could crash into each other and now you can't merge. We have to redo the work. It's terrible. You pop in Git. Now, how many developers per file can you have? How many you want? Now, the cost of merging is very low. The likelihood of things going very badly is very small as long as you merge soon. It's not how much you do, it's how soon you mix it, right? So the famous line that we say is when it comes to version control, you should be the bird and not the statue. So you want to make your deposits frequently, not receive them all at once. So version control changed the cardinality. People, developers per file, instead of developer and file being a one-to-one. Another one of them is tasks per team member. And we could often see this organizations that are new to Scrum usually. And what they do is on the day one of the work, they take all of the things they want to do and they assign all of them to the developers. So now every developer has enough work to do to last the entire time. Okay, so we know that tasks per developer is the cardinality. Many tasks, one developer. Is that necessary? For a developer to be busy, how many tasks do they have to have? If you have one thing to do, you're busy. If I have 17 things to do, can I get more of them done than if I have only one thing to do right now? No. Okay, well, so it looks like one-to-one sounds good. But wait a minute. Since the 1990s, we've had this thing called pair programming, where one task has two developers. And things get done with better solutions and fewer defects which, by the way, is really another story where they'll talk about defects in just a second. And then these people at Hunter Industries, somewhere on our West Coast, came up with this idea of mob programming. Now you have an entire team working on how many features at once? Okay, and who is the developer who completed that feature? All of them. The cardinalities change. So I'm trying to suggest today, my basic thesis is that we have assumed cardinalities, right? People per task, tasks per people, features per release, releases per feature, all of these kinds of things that maybe the way we evolve our industry is by questioning those cardinalities. They don't always work out. For instance, how many bosses should one developer have? This is surprising because we went from one manager for 50 developers, and then it became like, well, actually one manager per 10 developers. And then it's like, you know what, we could matrix and we could have 7 managers per developer, but actually 7 managers per 50 developers, and each developer would take jobs from 7 managers, which is also really great once we have them competing against each other for developer time, because you know that can't possibly go wrong. Yeah, it goes wrong all the time. So it seems like sometimes we experiment with them and they don't pan out. Maybe more managers per developer is not really helpful. And we have seen cases where you don't actually manage developers. Bizarre. Sociocracy and holacracy, and there's a bunch of different systems where they kind of manage themselves. This agile idea is that we have self-organizing teams, right? And one of the cases I had was, okay, what about the cardinality of developers per team? And what we found out is you don't have to have one. We did an experiment several years ago where we decided that there are N teams. And anytime you wanted to change teams, you could change teams. Now, the upper management freaked out a little bit, right? That means, okay, if I am a line manager over developers, I don't know who my team members are. They could change from day to day. How am I going to be responsible for keeping my team members busy if they could change ranks at any time? And we found out it doesn't matter. If you think the job of the manager is to manage the individual, this would be a nightmare. But it's not. The job of the manager is to manage the outcomes for the team. So if the managers can assign to the team and the team can form up the cardinalities they want according to the task and the moment of the task, it doesn't make a difference. It works great. Well, who does your end-year review? Turns out that's even an interesting story. Is the answer is 1 review per developer per year? Is that the right way of doing things? Cardinalities, my friends, cardinalities.
I just want to add one point over here is that because of the questions you just raised right now, many organizations keeps stuck where they were actually, and even though they feel that whatever you just mentioned will be helping, but just because it doesn't really making sense from how you're going to manage people, how you're going to review stuff, they get stuck in that world completely.
You know, the historical side of that is when I was young, at least, and I was young once, trust me, I swear it. When I was young, pretty much not only was software expensive to release, but it was almost always done in all the books. If you read it, all the books and the magazine articles and everything that was cool that was going on was being done by software contractors. They were huge, right? And they would hire analysts, and then when the analysts were done, they would hire programmers, and when the programmers were getting done, they would start hiring testers. So you would staff the phase as you approach the phase because that was economical, right? If you're a contractor, you start with a contract and your goal is to stick to your contract. So you have a change control panel whose job is to keep the rules from changing, because you've already built the designs, and a change in requirements changes the designs. Now you're going to have to bring back more analysts and pay them again, right? And everything that was written, all of the methodologies, all the articles were written by contract companies, contract houses, right? So how many of you are working for a contract house? Is everyone here working for a contract house now? Is anyone here doing in-house software? Looks like a lot of people are doing in-house software.
Yeah, doing in-house software.
Yes. Okay. In in-house software, do you hire the analysts and then hire the programmers, then hire the testers? No, you have a standard staff. In fact, even in the case of most contract houses, you hire and maintain a staff. So you've got a weekly burn rate. You know what the costs are. So why must you have a phased approach with a known endpoint like that? Well, in an in-house software, you don't. Those things aren't necessary. You don't need to have an endpoint. You need to know what's one step better than what you have. In a contract house, you still have that. Contract house, of course you have to estimate, because you need to know if you're on track to your endpoint. In-house software, do you have to have those estimates? It turns out we're finding that for in-house software, you probably don't. Well, why do people run initiatives for in-house software like they were projects? Because contractors wrote the methodologies. The legitimate way to run a house, legitimate, the accepted legitimate way to do things is to run it as a project. So people run a product whose real goal is just to expand and improve the revenue stream and make customers happy, as if it were a series of projects, because they don't know how else to run things. The books were written by contract houses. Is that necessary now? Probably not. Probably never was. It's an idea. Yeah, the legitimate feel is that you have to have a project to make it real. By the way, my favorite thing about Agile transitions, whenever we do help somebody with a transition, we come in and we say, okay, here's what we're going to do. And they say, okay, well, what's the endpoint going to look like? What are the milestones? And what are the phases to get there? And we say, of course, you're going to ask that question because you've always been waterfall. But that's not how you run a transition. If we waterfall the transition, then we'll end up in waterfall still. If we're going to do an agile transition, let me show you how agile works, and let's all work in an agile way. Often we get pushback. Oh no, this is like a real effort. We should run it as a project. Not necessary. Products to projects is not one-to-one.
Maybe you may want to elaborate on this one actually, because many people may be understanding how, for example, Scrum works, but then people, I mean, this whole value chain continues to be living in the waterfall anyways. So if the small part of it, maybe you'll be working in Scrum actually, but the rest of the stuff is still going through this journey of waterfall. So do you see a change over there?
Yeah, well, we're seeing a change. It's slow in coming. And I think, let me describe a fairly typical scenario.
Sure.
Companies has reached a point where they're not delivering reliably. And they're also, by the way, particularly upset because they're not delivering according to their estimates. They thought they would be further along than they are. They're behind according to their estimates, which, by the way, just means the estimates were short. Don't get biased on this, right? The estimates were short. They're not even with the estimates. They're wanting to make up time. And so they decide we need to fix the developers. So let's bring in some consultants to fix the developers. I know we'll make the development team be agile. And then that way they'll get things done 4 times faster, because somebody wrote a book with a really stupid title that suggested 4 times faster. Okay. When we come into the organization, we take a look at it, and usually it's not the development teams going slow at all, right? The problem is the way that we're doing the work, the way it's organized, the flow of work is poor. The organization isn't agile. And so as we start coming up the chain, it's like, well, you realize that product management needs to change for this to work. And quite often it's like, no, we just want you to fix those guys. And we can take a contract with that, and we can make an agreement. You know what? All right, we'll help you work better within a water flow situation. But we need to agree on what better means. I can't guarantee you that every estimate you invent, that they'll be able to do that. That's assuming that we can force reality to match every fantasy, no matter how strong or false or far-fetched or realistic. We can't. Reality is reality. That's where the rubber meets the road. But what we can do is we can make sure that from day one, the software runs. And every day that it's running, we can see what's done and isn't, and we can demonstrate that for you. That means you will know sooner when your estimates are bad and when you need to be aware of your promises and maybe change the depth to which you've set your endpoint. It might be that you need to have a data ingestion system, but it maybe doesn't have to start with all of the data that could ever possibly appear. Maybe you should start with the data for your 2 biggest customers. And then after the release, we can take on the next few. Maybe we should, alter the depth of the promise rather than the breadth of the promise rather than eliminate it as a feature. So this is a fairly typical thing. And that's when you're dealing with promises that are being sold. And that's really, I think, a business illness, right? People feel like you need to sell a promise for a thing on a date because we think that we're buying a thing. And what do people say? If I bought my car and I didn't ask what it cost first, that would be irresponsible of me, wouldn't it? And everybody nods their head, yes. If you're going to buy a car, you need to know what the cost is. Okay, but let's talk about in-house and software as a service. How much is your cost for electricity? Not this month, your lifetime cost for electricity. Shouldn't you know what all of your electricity is going to cost before you buy any? How about your groceries? What's your lifetime grocery cost? Don't you think you should know what groceries cost before you start eating? How about your internet lifetime costs? Do you know what your lifetime cost is? Well, why is that different? Why is it that with healthcare, you don't need to know what your lifetime cost is, and for electricity and groceries, you don't need to know, but for a car, you do? Well, with a car, you are buying a thing. When you buy a thing, if that's your mindset, then you have to know what it costs. But what if you're not buying a thing? What if you're buying groceries? You know next week you're going to need some more groceries. When you buy internet, you know next month you're going to need some more internet. Plumbing, you may pay to have a plumbing job done, but how much are you going to spend on water? Well, you're always going to want water, and you're going to buy it every month. You pay for it as you go because you use it as you go. And this is the problem with the waterfall mindset is you're in a hole. You make no money until you sell it at the end. Software as a service, internal software, all of the other situations that are not contract programming, you're using it while you're building it. You don't have to make that decision. You can decide, you know what, this week I would like to power wash my house and wash my car, and we're going to be making soup and freezing it. I'm going to use more water this month. And that's okay. You can budget on the short. So this is the idea. Everyone thinks you have to have a project, but a project probably isn't the legitimate way of doing things always. It is a way of buying a thing, which is not the way most software is built these days. Does that help? Does that help at all? Did that answer the question even?
Actually, what I was looking for is that, first of all, it really opens up or broadens up the way we think about things. But at the same time, I was just thinking like people still, in the enterprises, they still have this whole cycle. Like there is a budgeting, there is a, some kind of business cases approval is there, and then after that. So basically, before you still even start something to work upon, actually, you may be going through a lot of cycles, actually. So when you look at, even though in your sense, they may be still working from the product standpoint, right? So when it happens, then is there an alternate approach where they can really think from the agile perspective and not really kind of water flow kind of stuff.
Yes, we've got, there's a lot of focus over here right now on product. So if you want to think about it this way, you have an organization, and then rather than having projects that they fund and greenlight,
Yeah.
you have products.
Yes.
A product represents a revenue stream, right?
Mhm.
So it has certain expenses and it has an income stream, and you want it to be cash positive. The more cash positive, the better. Now, you hand this off to a product manager. Their job isn't to have this many features added by this point in time. Their job is to protect and grow the revenue stream. Sometimes that's done by adding features. So there are developers there to add features as they need them. But you don't have a manager to be over the adding of features. You have a manager to be over the whole product stream. So if there's a problem in operations, you may have developers go and make this more operable, right? You may have a DevOps work going on, right? If there's trouble deploying, you may put DevOps people into that. If there's a problem with user interface or user experience, you may bring in, more effort into the user experience and revise that with programming. But it may be the thing you do is just improve your sales. Maybe the thing you do is improve your marketing. Maybe the thing you're doing is calling up your old customers and asking, what do you use to patch up around the corners where we don't do what you want? How can we incorporate more features that make you happy? At that point, they don't need to have projects. You don't have to have, the next phase 3 release by June of next year. You just have, what do we do to make our customers happy and to make better sales and to make the system run well in the operating center?
So
It's
just
an
to make
entirely
sure
different view.
just to make sure
Sorry.
that I mean, the focus now happens to be on the outcomes and not on the features you are developing, basically, because feature may or may not help towards the outcome, and it may be just you need to focus on the marketing right now or the sales or whatever, basically. So if you looking at it from the holistic standpoint, it's no more about the features anymore. It's more than that. It's more about the outcomes.
Yeah, and customer discovery. Sometimes we find we have the right product, we're just selling it to the wrong people. Which, that's a big moment. They call that a pivot. If you read up on Lean Startup, it's all about customer discovery.
Yep.
We had a case where we were focusing on the end users of our e-learning. So the students, how do we make this better for the students? How do we make this better for the students? And then one day we realized that almost all the sales are not being made to the students. The sales are at a different level of an organization. We don't get that many people off the street buying. But a company will buy a license for 200 programmers. Well, how do we serve them? Turns out we didn't serve them well enough. So now we have to give them mechanisms. How can they, what kind of reporting do they need? What can we do to the system to ensure that it's actually being used? How can we add reminders? How can we engage in a larger scale? How can we help people higher in their organization to monitor, not necessarily to, rate people, because I don't like that kind of thing, but to help them to drive engagement so that their investment is safe? And how do we help them not buy in the situation where they would be wasting their money? So we started focusing up. We switched our focus, and suddenly all of the features we added were for supporting the buyers, because frankly, the users are having a pretty good time, right?
Absolutely. Makes sense.
By the way my company works is we don't have Scrum, we don't have Waterfall. If Josh, the owner of our company, oops, sorry, moved the wrong way, Industrial Logic. If the owner woke up tomorrow and said, you know what, the problem we have is we really need a search engine. We really need people to be able to do a much better job searching around inside of our content. Then we could start tomorrow building it. Why? Well, because we don't have a backlog of 6 months of work. We can respond in the moment as we learn things. And actually, we're doing that right now. We have a company our size, 40 some odd, 50 some odd people. We have 3 initiatives. 3.
So whatever you
Because if
just
you,
mentioned, actually, do you feel that it is, I mean, the size of the company right now, the industrial logic is 50, for example. Uh, is it, can we think that it can also happen for large enterprises as well?
sure. One of the things that they said in the Lean Startup book, if you read Eric Ries or Don Reinertson's work,
Yeah.
one of the things they bring up is that any large organization can actually be made up of products and of lean startups. So if you are trying to address a particular industry, you can then focus on some users in that industry with a product. And this doesn't keep you from consolidating this across teams and across products. You can still do that. But within that space, you can be starting something that disrupts the industry in your favor. And that's something that everyone can do, even in very, very large organizations. But what you will find is you probably won't have a team of 5,000 people reporting to you.
Yeah.
Because that won't make any sense. There is a cardinality of managers to people, managers to teams that will work. And by the way, managers to teams works pretty well. Managers to individuals has certain challenges. And we could talk about those for a long time, but I don't think that's the purpose of the day.
Sure. Well, that made a lot of sense, actually. I think it clarifies a lot of things for the people over here. Thank you.
So should we move to questions?
Yes, I think.
I've certainly prattled on long enough.
Let me just see. So I've sent you the link, actually. So and let me just mute people.
We have an unmuted mic. I like hearing the voices of children, though. I don't know what they're saying, but I enjoy the voices of children.
Okay, so let me just see this.
So the first one is, how do you arrive at correct cardinality at the start of product development? I don't know that you can. I think that you have to be willing to shift cardinalities, right? So it may be that the structure you have at the beginning isn't the structure you have at the end. If we're learning, we're changing, right? Programmers, we often say that if you look at code you wrote 6 months ago and you're proud of it still, then you've wasted 6 months of your life. Right? You should know enough to think, oh, here's all the things I did wrong. Oh, I could do that so much better if I were to do it now. That proves that you're learning. Why is it that the structure of the organization on the day of its founding or on the day of the prior reorg should be the right structure? Well, why can't you shift it? Can't you change when you learn things? Well, you can, but that's disruptive, right? I mean, I used to talk to Charles, and now I have to talk to Linda. And I know Charles better than Linda. Well, okay. Fine. Once we start talking to Linda instead of Charles, does the software get delivered better? If it does, then we talk to Linda. If not, then maybe we think about reassigning somehow, changing things up. What works best? By the way, the enemy of everything in software development, I think, comes down to the idea of maximizing instead of optimizing. And we could do a whole show on that. But I have a bunch of people, I should maximize the amount of the work they're doing. Well, is the most work going to be the best work? What is the best rate of work that we could have? What's the best rate of release that we could have? People don't ask that. They ask about the most. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a huge problem we have. So the cardinality, at the beginning, I don't know that it's possible to know in advance. I think that you start with the best guess and you make it safe to change. The monster that lurks hidden in the shadows always is, if I'm not right, what happens? Right? And if your organization is such that if you're not right, you're a failure, then you can't afford to be wrong, which also means you can never afford to be seen learning. Your organization is locked. Unless that can change, when learning is rewarded and respected, then you will begin to optimize your structure to the work you're doing and the community you're serving. And until then, you can't. Sorry, I'm preaching again. So the first question is, we don't know, can we make it safe to change our minds if we're wrong?
Sure.
What team, yes, go ahead.
Yes, I mean, you can go ahead, please. Sorry.
Okay. What team size is too big for mob programming? By the way, that's an awesome question, and everybody's asking this. In special cases, training situations, I've seen it work with some pretty ridiculously large numbers, where ridiculously large is on the order of 20. That's really large. And you have to have tiny little, like you have to change drivers every 2 or 3 minutes to get through everybody. Otherwise people tune out. That's really hard. Now I have a theory, and I could post a link to it. Maybe Srikant, help me with it later so I don't forget.
Yeah.
I have an article that says that programming is 11/12 thinking. And there's a basis for this that we've worked out. And it seems to hold up pretty well. 11/12 of our work is not typing. It's all the thinking and learning. Okay? If that's true, and the goal of mob programming is to bring everybody's knowledge and brain work to bear on one problem, then it would seem that 12 is probably one too many, because now we've got too many brains per task. I mean, if it's 11/12 thinking, then 11/12 of us are thinking, well, one's typing. That might be okay. That might be the best we could do. It might be optimum as far as we know. But I tend to find out that we ramp up, and it gets better and better as we get up to 9 or so. 7 to 9 gets really good. And then somewhere in that neighborhood, it starts to tail off.
Yeah.
And it starts to be where there are more brains than the task really requires, or that can be engaged at once. And you end up with some people working while other people are watching. That's your real clue. When you go to workers, watchers, you've got too many people, or the wrong people, right?
I'm just,
So I tend to find 7-ish is good.
I was also thinking, like, whatever may be a kind of definition of a small team, for example. I mean, I was thinking like 3 to 5 people is a right definition, because after that, basically you start having subgroups in the team actually. So when you have these number of people, I think that may be the right way to go. And definitely you can evolve further for 7 people as well. But that was I was thinking actually.
Isn't it surprising how often it seems to land right around that number? It's 3 to 4 groups of 3 to 4 people. It's 7 plus or minus 2. It's mobbing seems to be 11/12. So right around 7 or 8 people seems to be optimum. 6, 7 people.
Mm-hmm.
We just keep landing around that magic number over and over. I don't know why, but there just seems to be something to it. Also, by the way, if the work is really boring, then 2 people's good, because one person helps keep the other person awake and keep them from making stupid mistakes. And then when the work's really hard, 2 people's not nearly enough.
Yeah.
So lot size is too big. Oh, here we go. Even for in-house product, if roadmap is not available, how can milestone be achieved? That's one of those great places where the answer is inside the question, right? How do you have milestones if you don't have a roadmap? What if you are day by day making decisions to satisfy your customers? So in the morning you get in and you take a look and you see, I have 7 customers who are struggling with one issue. Team, this is our issue today. At the end of the day, they have completed it, they've tested it, they have proven it out with existing data, they've released it to the customers. The next morning when you wake up, you don't have the same problem. You have a new system. Okay, now today, what is the problem users are having, right? If I have a roadmap, if I know what my end point is going to be, then I can have milestones toward that end point. But what if your decision, your direction isn't set? What if you're not driving from Chicago to New York, right? Maybe today we wake up and we're going to go to Iowa, which is, by the way, the opposite direction from New York, in case you're not into American geography. Chicago to New York is about a 14-hour drive. So with our great highway system, that's covering a lot of miles. Done it in one day. Iowa is in the opposite direction toward California. So what if you wake up in the morning and your goal is, you know, to be at a higher elevation than you are today? Well, which directions go up? Well, let's pick one of those. Let's go up that direction, right? Oh, we're high enough, but the problem is now we don't really have enough of a water supply. Well, if I cut across this mountain, there's a spring and I can get water from that spring. Now I get there. Now the problem is that the ground is rocky and it's hard to build here to put up a shelter. Well, if we just go up another 100 feet, there's a good place there. So there's this hill climbing heuristic, right? There can't be milestones if your goal is to respond to the needs of the community. There can only be milestones if there's an end destination in mind. So yeah, you can't have milestones without. What you end up having instead is successes. So yesterday we solved this important client problem. 2 weeks before that, we added this new sales feature that has got us new money. The week before that, we solved a problem in production where with bandwidth. And before that, we solved a problem where the logs were building up and clogging the file system. And before that, we solved the problem, right? All you have are successes. And so your salespeople are really in a bind because they can only sell what you already have. I just saw like a dozen people grinning then. And I heard the psyches of 1,000 people lighting up with like, boy, that would be awesome. And then some salesperson's like, well, that's actually not good. I need to make promises to sell the product we have. It's not good enough for me to really be able to sell a lot. Oh, really? What's the thing that's missing? I don't have an endpoint that's conflicting with the feature you need to sell my software. It's not out of scope. It is the next thing we need to do to make more money.
I was just thinking about what you just mentioned is like, one is responding to the problems the customers may be facing. Another direction may be towards making the customer experience pretty good, and experience basically talks a lot of things actually. And another perspective may be around your own directions. Like for example, you would like to have 10% more customers in next quarter, for example. So when you have such goals, actually, I mean, don't you see like is a kind of still you have the goals, you may want to move towards that, isn't really moving towards a kind of roadmap, because you start having the destination now, isn't it?
Yeah, but you can choose which one's correct now, right? If you start with, I want to make more customers, and then we fill up a backlog with 1,000 things that we think might bring customers. Now we have a roadmap, and now we can have milestones. But now if the problem is that we have trouble in the operations center, that is now a disruption to the plan. It's broken the route, the roadmap. We're going to miss our milestones. We're a failure. Well, are you a failure if you solve a production problem instead of adding new features? So the goal would be not to load up the backlog. There's no reason to have a loaded backlog. It's not that helpful in a product environment. Project, contract work, that's different. And it may be that your structure needs to be entirely different for contract than for product work. But you're serving a community. What's the thing that best serves the community right now? And you talked about it could be the user experience. Okay, what's the thing we can do quickly that will improve the user experience for a number of people? That's serving that community. And then when it's like there's a production problem, well, solving that problem serves the community best. So what serves the community of the product best is a product thought. It's an entirely different way of thinking.
Yep.
Don't load up your backlog. If you load up your backlog and everything that's in there is a promise, then you've started off in debt. You owe all those backlog items to your product owner. And you must deliver them, and not delivering them or doing something different to serve the community is a failure. Don't make it wrong to do good things.
Yeah, that's as you said, like it's a completely different way of thinking.
Now, if you're on a contract, then by golly, fulfill that contract. Make it work day one, start adding the most important features first. Keep in mind, you're probably not going to make it. You're not going to get everything done on time. It's very unlikely. It could happen, but it's unlikely. Most likely risk, not going to complete everything. So you start from day one and you plan for the best failure possible. If we don't get it all, what we do have is the best that we could have in the time, right? And at that point, if you have other problems, you may need to bring other experts in temporarily to take care of those because you need to be on track. So I want to give respect to contract houses.
So, question, very interesting point of views you bring out, and I have to give this a little bit more thought. But in the meanwhile, something that came to my mind is we are in a market where companies are publicly traded. We have shareholders and market projections and all those kinds of things. So in that context, I understand the milestones, and maybe not exactly product milestones need to be talked about in terms of features, but we'll have to give some projections, and they're not always going to be right. We know that, but how do we approach that? I'm Sai Krishna, by the way. So your thoughts?
Sai Krishna.
Nice give those things. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a good thing because there's always, some kind of element of reality that keeps us from working in an ideal way. There always is. If the people at the top, if the shareholders are insistent that the right way to do this is to have a specific set of projections and milestones and what have you, then everybody who's working for them, you're either going to go along with it or you're going to work somewhere else, right? So if you could change how they see, if they're interested in trying to see what they can do with customer discovery and with a product mindset and with focusing on outcomes, we're going to grow revenue and sales to this particular vertical industry by 7%. Okay, that's great. If they want to think about it that way and work with those kinds of goals, then you can definitely have a product mindset all the way down, right? But if it is, we will have this feature and these features and this product done by this date, then again, you're now in a project environment, and the rules for product and the rules for projects are different. You may have to change your organization, and go optimize for the things that are important. So, contracts are paid on delivery.
Something like, if I may, something like product outcomes, it could be outcome based, right? So we can say we want to grow revenue by this much projection wise, not necessarily product features, because those will come as per the need of the market and we will respond to that. So we can give those kinds, but it's always a projection. It's not like written in stone. We are going to target something, right? And we're going to do our best if there's an operations problem, we're not going to say we're going to ignore that, because that will definitely make you go in the wrong direction in terms of revenue and all that, right? So yeah, but we have to have those conversations. I think first I have to digest all this first myself, so that I can put a lot more thought behind it, so that I have the conviction and I'm clear in what I'm driving at, so that I can have the right conversations and help lead, or at least be on the journey together with the management. And it's not an easy path, I would definitely say, because this is a little different kind of a thought process than what's prevailing, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I think you'll find the lean startup literature will be helpful to you. They start off with, we have an idea, we have this many months worth of money, we need to become cash positive before we run out.
Yeah, I mean, startup and all that, I'm worried more about established companies, set in their ways of working, and huge companies. Those are the kind that's hard to pivot, right? So smaller ones, yes, you can turn on a heel.
Yeah, so the thing they have in common is that there is a goal and there is a schedule. And the goal is an outcome in this case. With the lean startup, it's an outcome. We need to find customers and create a revenue stream. With a large company, it may be still, an outcome by a date is expected, and that's going to be what bolsters the share prices, or, chases the exit, or, buys the vacation home for the VP. Whatever the case is that's useful. There is, again, a goal, and the outcome is understood, and then people do experimenting, even with Lean Startup, they experiment with how to achieve that goal and they track themselves against it, right? So we can see that we did well enough this month that we have burn rate for another month of operation beyond what we used to have. So we track that, right? And in organizations that are tracking outcomes, that's very common. You'll set your outcome and you'll track the work you're doing to see if it contributes to the outcome or if it diminishes the outcome, right? And that's okay. But it may mean some of your cardinalities change too.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Tim, just want to add to what you were saying in terms of maximizing versus optimizing, right? To me, I think that really comes from a very, very strong manufacturing mindset or a traditional engineering mindset where more is better, bigger is better. I mean, I still date, I'm so intrigued to actually know that there were several companies who measured a productivity of a developer based on the number of lines of code written. The more code you wrote, the more productive you were. I mean, how as human beings, we have just misunderstood the nature of software work. To me is still a big mystery, and that hangover still remains even when I go on consulting engagements even today. And I think people don't understand the difference between, again, a complicated problem and a complex one. And I think we approach software development not only with a manufacturing mindset, but it's also probably tied to that, is that it is a complicated problem. That's how people see it, whereas actually it is a complex problem to solve. So I was wondering if any of this has the roots in the cardinalities which we were stuck on, and now that we are beginning to understand, at least some companies are beginning to understand that software is complex. Are the views toward cardinalities changing because of this understanding that it's no longer complicated but complex?
I think that there was, so certainly first, by the way, I once was in a lot of trouble, possible jeopardy. I was called in by the boss of a project because I was producing minus 200 lines of code per week. And it was messing up all the statistics that they were reporting to their customers and their bosses. So the idea was that, what a developer did was to sit at a table and produce widgets, and you produce N widgets per hour. More widgets maximized is better. The idea about, as languages have changed, lines of code per feature and lines of code per developer are changed, but still you find people saying, well, we couldn't possibly do pair programming because that's only one set of hands typing where we could have had two.
Yeah.
So there's a belief that developing software is physical motion, specifically of fingers on keyboards. And people have tried to measure efficiency in hours per week per developer. So the belief was that if somebody put in 70-hour week, they were more efficient than a developer who put in 40 hours a week, which I think is ridiculous. By the way, the other thing you hear is people say that they find that TDD is not efficient because when they don't TDD, they're typing into the program all day long. But when they do TDD, they keep stopping to run the tests. And like, wait, what does efficiency mean? It's hours typing versus hours not typing. Yeah. They feel like by sometimes not typing, that lowers their efficiency. But if you look at the results they get, they're getting done faster with fewer problems and actually getting to devote more time to developing versus bug fixing. It's way more efficient, but it doesn't feel efficient if you're measuring active time to resting time. But as we go from the manufacturing mindset, that is, of course, the root of many of our problems. And there's no question. When you look at mechanical motion and you are ignoring what people are doing, really, manufacturing for us is done by a compiler. We write up the plans, the compiler produces the product. A factory produces identical copies of the same thing over and over. And you can tell how fast it's doing that, and you can calculate a lot of good things about that. Okay, how do you make a second copy of your program? you run the copy command, or HTTP, use get or curl. How do your customers get copies of your program? They download it. Who's paying for that? Well, really they are. I mean, we pay something for the storage and bandwidth, but so do they. They pay for their own bandwidth. So they can make all the copies they want. They can download to 18 machines or 1,000 machines. We don't care. The manufacturing is done by HTTP. We don't do the manufacturing. And the product to be duplicated, the initial version, is produced by the compiler. We don't do manufacturing at all. What are we doing? Design.
Yeah.
And when people understand that, that changes the nature of things, right? Oh, it really is 11/12 thinking. Well, what do you do when you get stuck? Well, if you're working on a factory and you're having frustration, you just calm down and work harder. What do you do when you're on a design and you're stuck with a design problem? Well, everybody knows you get up and you take a break. You walk away from it. You go talk to somebody. But I've seen too many organizations that have really focused on keeping people from conversing and keeping them from taking breaks and keeping them from reading, when these are people who are collecting data to make a better design and who need the perspectives that they can get. So yes, when we go from manufacturing mindset to design mindset, I think it changes everything. How do managers address people? How do tasks go to groups? How do teams conduct their work? How many hours should you be typing versus not typing?
So there's
Sunil,
a
you're a
funny
wise man.
incident, right? There's a funny incident. So when I joined the software industry in 2001, you know, my senior came and asked me within a month, where is code created? And my instinctive response was in the desktop. We didn't have laptops then. We had desktops. And he said, you're wrong. Code is created here. He pointed to the brain and said, that the machine is just there to reflect what's in your head. So that was like an aha moment for me, which has stayed with me, you know, till date. So.
You and I would have a great conversation about signal to noise ratio.
Yes.
We should, hey, can we have another talk sometime and we get here and we talk about signal to noise?
Absolutely.
All right.
Anytime.
Hey, Tim, I actually posted this question there. So just on a generic, right, when you're thinking about products and services and stuff like that. So this concept of product looking more and more like services, and services now looking more and more like experiences, right? So in effect, whether you're designing a product, software or hardware, or is it a service component, actually the thing that is going to be made out is an experience, right? So the focus is on more like who creates the best experiences, ultimately comes out with the best product, services, software, anything. So given that thought process, I would like to hear your thoughts on how do you kind of think about you know, working in this environment. What is the cardinality you will put for funding, for organizing, for flow of work, and how do you go about it? I know it's more like there can be definitely some example companies like you know, people focusing more on experiences like Apple and other stuff. But if you could give us some thought process on that and say, well, I know industrial logic might not have much of the internal projects, right? But I'm just thinking, if you were to curate experiences and that is the outcome that you're desiring, how would you go about thinking of this?
So there's, by the way, the place I want to go, but I'm trying to resist, is to remember that finance is a service. Management is a service.
Yep.
Right? And if it's a service, then the experience of that service should be good, right? And we should probably focus on how well do we provide the service of financing and the service of it. But I don't really want to go there. I think the biggest thing is the idea of drip funding seems to be pervading the insides of organizations now. So, you know, I'm going to hire Rohan to do some work for me. At the end of the first month, we'll see how it's going. Is this worth the money I'm spending? Sure, it's worth the money I'm spending. Let's go a couple more months. Okay, a couple more months go by, we review. You know what? This is still working out pretty well. I'm willing to continue paying for this rate of progress in the market. You know, and at some point, it becomes that we're not getting that rate of progress. We need to look into it. So you start thinking in months of developer time, months of team time that you're paying for. What's my burn rate and what's the value I'm getting for the burn rate? And if we're not happy with the ratio, then we either need to find a way to focus on more value or reduce burn rate. Most people don't like to reduce their income, so that becomes a difficult thing to think about. Do we shift people to other teams? Do we defund a team? But you start looking at initiatives, right? And you tend to start thinking in months instead of as endpoints, which is a really weird way to change, right? So I'm not going to fund your project to make a thing. I'm going to fund you to be developing, like an R&D project. I'm going to fund a quarter of your R&D toward this goal. And then we'll talk about it at the end.
Right. Like I think you got it right. And I think when we have teams kind of focus more on creating that experience, they kind of act not like development teams. They're more like the innovation hubs, right? And then you have teams that want a reason to sustain. They create busy work. And the thinking from a perspective of, owning the organization, like as a CEO, is that how do you think of cardinalities in terms of funding with both of those? Because one, you need to kind of motivate into building those new experiences better. At the same time, not compromise too much on the operational element of sustaining the existing experience that we created, right? In between, you have folks who are doing things like creating busy work for job security, right? So that is also there, right? So I have these three pockets of teams, and I'm looking at how do I think of funding them and kind of keeping them more on the creation and sustaining of experiences rather than motivating towards stability kind of thinking and do the busy work, right? And that's where the thinking of Sunil comes in, like where the busy work or the terms of measuring in terms of coding and all that stuff. So what we are trying to do is pretty much morph out the mindset of the leaders itself and use that to create the teams. The fluidity that we need in the teams is obviously going to create insecurity with the wrong kind of team players, right? And that means getting the right hiring too. So a lot of decisions are being changed throughout our firm. But I think what I want to look at is like, how do you approach this at a high level from, yes, there are revenue streams, there are pockets funding coming in, we can definitely borrow some from the market too. But how do you kind of look at these three broad buckets and say what, right? Because we're not talking about mechanics of delivery or teams right now. We are talking about outcomes in terms of beyond products and services, more on experiences.
So one of the things I've seen, I worked with this fellow, his name is Brandon Carlson. He's from Des Moines, Iowa. He is one of the best out-of-the-box thinkers I've ever worked with. And the way we worked together was the two of us, we would come up with an idea and then we'd go into a room somewhere and close the door and argue like crazy for a day. And whatever came out of that argument was usually a pretty good idea. And one day he came in with an idea and I thought, oh, that is not going to work. I don't like this idea. And then the conversation turned to, well, what would it take for this to be workable? And then we found a yes together, something to agree to, and it worked beautifully. What he did was he drew 3 boxes up on the wall, right? So we just have these 3 boxes. One of them was features. One of the boxes was labeled architecture, and one of the boxes was labeled support. So he put an equals, I don't remember how many people we had. We'll pretend it was 50, because I don't remember how many it was. So you have the 3 boxes, and they have to add up to 50. And the product managers would come into the room, and there was a bunch of the product, and they're supporting sales and different verticals and all kinds of different groups. They came in and together they decided how many people are on features this month, how many people are on support this month, how many people, and they could shuffle the numbers according to the needs of the moment. Now, I think it was actually every 2 weeks, but however that works, whatever the period was, they would come in and they would make a decision. And then the teams would come up and it's like, okay, so we need 25 people on features, 25 people put their names underneath features. We need so many people on support, they put their names under support, right? So the team was fluid, but the management decided how much they wanted to invest because they know what an average developer salary is. Well, if we have $4 million to spend, I would put 2 million in new features this month. And then the next month it is, well, if we have $4 million to spend, I would put 3 million in support, right? And they could slide the scale, but they didn't have anything to do with who worked where. Everybody was self-choosing themselves to work on the teams. But at a portfolio level, they were choosing what kinds of work would be done and the proportions of the kinds of work according to their strategies. And that seemed to help them. Of course, the burn rate was constant. I mean, you pay all the developers all the time.
Right. Yeah, it really works well with a team size of like how industrial or we have like, under 50, right? So it really works because it's almost like a swarming organization. They go where the need is, and there is the pay grade and everything is based on each person's skill level. They can do whatever they want, where they want to go and where they want to be. And that's kind of that's metaphor. But in a larger organization where hierarchies have to be preserved, right? And you have certain communication methods hardened by very prescriptive methods, which many of us do here. So it becomes really difficult because for them, the perception of the leaders, and that's where we are thinking we are kind of hiring and firing leaders at present. We're not worried about the teams. The reason is like this notion of power being not the outcome you produce, but the number of people you have under you, has been set up for a long time in this organization, right? So it is about almost like we know the answers, we are able to do this, but when we do it for the clients, there is a duality of problems. We can produce the augmented value that we are producing for the client, but the clients, because they are aware, they are structured, and their current way of operations becomes the hurdle for them, right? So our complete build and delivery of a product will take, say, for example, $1 million. Even to take that to production, for them, they'll take $5 to $7 million because of those structures. So it's a crazy animal when the systems that we interact with are not aligned to the outcome that we think is the right outcome, because each division, micro component of an organization has their own intent, which is totally different from the org's intent. And that's where fixing a particular cardinality for any outcome of at a higher level, like an OKR, for example, becomes very difficult. So there can be multiple variations of it, right?
I just want to add one point over here is that, I basically take a kind of analogy, which I took in the last conversation, is about changing old building and building a new building. So changing a old building is not really easy, actually. It's like the old, so in case you want to make changes, you have to be really careful of how it will be impacting things around. But when you are creating new building, then you can basically lay down all these cultural nuances as well, even if it is a large organization. So this was a kind of understanding based on what I got through from Henrik Niebuhr presentation on Spotify case study around his engineering culture. How they, even if it is a 1,500 people organization, they still have that kind of way of working where the teams are fluid, so they don't really have the teams defined for a certain segment based on the needs. These team structure keeps on changing actually. So I feel that while creating the large organizations from the scratch, you should be able to put these kind of nuances. But when you are looking at the old buildings, for example, legacy organizations, I feel that irrespective of anything, these kind of challenges will be there, or do you think any work around for that?
So there's an interesting piece that goes with this too, by the way. Have you read Systemantics, also known as the Systems Bible?
No.
I highly recommend everybody get a copy of Systemantics. It's by John Gall, G-A-L-L. And I believe you can find it under the name The Systems Bible. If you want to buy a copy somewhere, it's definitely worth a read. He suggests that most human organizations are about 5% efficient. we're woefully inefficient. And what an organization is made to do is not what it actually does. What it says it's doing is not what it's really doing. Organizations have a reality distortion field to them. What the system reports must be true. If the system doesn't report it, it must not be true. Everybody gets, perception of reality gets twisted. Yes, it is by John Gall. So you will find that there is a thing called role success. And, the hierarchy must be preserved is an interesting piece of role success. And I'm not going to say that it's wrong. I want you to be successful. I would love for you all to be, the most successful people on earth by this time next year. And I know that that's weird and hard sometimes, but role success is one of the things where a system works against its own best interest, right? So if I am not willing to reduce my staff size in order to efficiently increase the revenue and the customer base of my organization, doesn't that raise a question? If my position is more important within my company than my company's position in the market, then it sounds like I wanted to be the VP when we crater in, right? I want to have the best title when we die, as opposed to I want us to be successful together. Role success is very powerful, though. I know it's very powerful. It's every place I've ever been, people, I won't do this thing if it might cost me my job. I worked hard to get here. I want to stay here. I want to be successful in my place, in my company, right? So it's a very difficult game, right? We have, in basketball, they have an MVP award. Baseball, they do it too. I guess everybody does it. How do you like to get the MVP award on the most losing team in the league, right? Why? Well, I made sure that I made all the important plays and everybody else didn't get to. Therefore, I win. I'm the best one on my team that's lost every game this year. It's probably not a recipe for success. That's me, my success versus our success is probably the wrong way to see it. I don't want to preach on that, but I just did. Role success is a thing to watch for. It's a misalignment, right? It's when your position within the company is more important than your company. Then we've probably stopped serving others. Likewise, if you're a manager and you have a team and your success is important, but your team's success isn't.
Yep.
Think about it. That's also one of the things that we have to deal with is what is the manager's to team and why is it important? It's important that I have 5,000 direct reports. Why? Well, because I want to be seen well within my company. Well, maybe that's the way to get success. Maybe that's important. Okay, well, let's say you're going to do that. Don't just assume that you just do that. The question is, what is the most powerful, effective, useful, kind, thoughtful, energetic, optimum way to do that if that's what you're going to do? What's the best way for you to have 5,000 direct reports? Right? What's the optimum? How can you have 5,000 people say, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that I worked for Sunil. This was the best thing I've ever done. That's what you want. If you're going to be that, if you're going to be big well. And you probably can be better than other people if you think about, what are your optimums? What's your alignment? How do you serve? Where's the safety, right? What is the experience of being managed? How can we make that best? I think I'm kind of running out to the end of the time maybe on that question.
Yeah.
Tim, this is Ajinkya. So what you just said actually resonates, but in most of the cases, whatever people are doing in the organization, it's an effect of what they are getting measured on, right? So the MBA theory, for example, what you measure brings out the actions, right? So how do you, I mean, wouldn't that be a cause to, change the culture of the organization rather than this thing? And how would you approach that?
So there's a nice article. I've already written it down so I don't have to repeat it all, called What Should We Measure? It's on the Industrial Logic blog. Maybe we can get a link to that here. What should we measure? And it talks about the risks of measurement, which you have brought up. One of them is Goodhart's law is one of the problems. And Goodhart was an economist who said that when a metric becomes a target, then it loses its qualification as a metric, right? So if I'm measuring how many lines of code you write, because I'm interested in that, and then I set a goal that you should have 50% more lines of code, then whatever I was measuring before is no longer true. Now I'm measuring if you were able to add more lines of code, rather than measuring, the work before. So Goodhart's law says, if you set a goal according to a metric, you ruin it as a metric. Sort of think about if you were to push your speedometer with your finger up to 200. You wouldn't be going 200 anymore, but you'd be measuring 200, right?
So it's the same thing I coach to my management team, saying that you use measurement as a tool to say that, okay, guys, there is a deviation, and please let me know where we can pitch in to help you. Not to use the measurement saying that, guys, you are not up to the mark. So that is the same thing you're saying, right?
Yeah, and I think that's important. The other one is, of course, Campbell's law is that a metric can corrupt the social process it's intended to measure. So the idea is that we should use metrics to find out what the truth is and then improve the truth, not set metrics and then cause the real world to meet our numbers. And Deming said, I think it was in Out of the Crisis, W. Edwards Deming said, the quote is, if you set a numeric goal for a manager, he will meet that goal even if he has to collapse the company to do it. So yeah, metrics are dangerous. Take a look at the article. I think you'll like it.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I think we are moving towards the end of this webinar, and just want to make sure that, because it happened to me earlier, there are a lot of things which need to sink in the mind. Actually, it will take some time, some reading actually. So there was some questions around how multiple features per release, multiple releases per feature can really happen. So we had a discussion on that, and we brought an article on that. So I just share over here. But I think these are the things which basically will help people think a little bit beyond what they have been thinking so far. And with that, I would like to thank you so much for coming over here and share this treasure trove actually.
Well, I thank you for the honor of providing this austere audience and some wonderful people. And Sunil, so good to see you. Srikant, it's always pleasant. The rest of you, thank you for your attention and for your thoughtfulness and for your questions.